Hey guys, how you doing? It's Rogaway here, and I'm back with another tutorial. And today we are looking at materials and textures in Blender 2.8. And I'm going to show you three different ways that you can apply textures and materials and how they work. And from these sort of three examples, I think you could probably apply it to almost anything. I'm not going to go into anything advanced. It's going to be more introductory, just so that you get the hang of using materials and textures, and we'll build from here. So the first thing we're going to look at is how to just apply a material and how to start creating a material. And for that, I'm going to open up the sword folder and open up the sword blend file. And what this is going to give us is a sword model, as you can see, from my favorite game, or one of my favorite games, Skyrim, of course. And you can see that this is just a very plain model, nothing too fancy. If I go in and out of edit mode, you can just kind of see how it looks. And so there's nothing really done to this model. It's basically just a gray, plain model at this point. So the first thing we want to look at is how we can actually change the color of this model to something else. And that's kind of our starting point. So if I click the model, I have it selected, you'll notice up in the top right that I got wireframe mode, I got solid mode, and then I've got one here called material preview mode. So that's what I want to go into. I'm going to click that, and you'll notice that the scene kind of changes. The sword becomes kind of a lighter white, and basically that's just the default material that we get to look at. Now, if you really want to see how your materials are looking, I recommend not really worrying so much about this material view. Instead, I would go up here to shading and actually switch to that so we can get a really good preview of what this object is looking like. All right, it gets rid of that grid and it just makes it a little easier to see what's happening. Now, a couple things I'm not really going to go into too much detail on here, but this area right here, this is the world that we are in. You can see as I rotate the camera, that world changes. And this is going to become really important later when we get into reflections. But for now, that is what our world looks like. All right, so I'm just going to get this kind of centered for now. Now, with the sword selected, if you want to actually see materials and you want to start creating materials, what you need to do is go to the Material tab or Material Properties down here. And you're going to see right now it's blank. There's nothing on this sword. The sword is blank. We're going to click New. You're going to notice when we click New that this appears down here. Don't worry about this. This is called Nodes. We're not going to look at that just yet. That's kind of advanced. We're going to keep our eyes over on the right-hand side here where we got all these options. We're going to kind of look at what that does. First thing you want to do is you want to get a preview of the material that you're working on. And you can see, as soon as this loads here, that we should, for some reason it's not showing up, but we should have a preview of what we are working on as far as the material goes. And I don't know why that's not showing, but let's start making some changes. Let's see if it shows up after. So first thing you want to probably do is change the color to something other than just white. And that is controlled by the base color. All right, you'll see a couple other things in here we'll get into a little bit later, but for now we're just keeping it really basic. We're going to change the base color to something other than white. And so if I click in here, you'll see that I can make this whatever color I want, and it's going to become that color. The base color controls the color that we see on that object. I'm not sure why the preview is not showing. I'm going to just close it for now because that's going to throw us off otherwise. And so, just trying a couple other things here. That's the first thing, is the base color. You'll notice that as I zoom in on this object, right now, the way that this material looks, it's almost like a shiny plastic. You can see that there's some reflection along the edges. It's very shiny. And we can control that as well. All right, so now that we've set our base color, we can scroll down a little bit further here. If we want to control how, how reflective this object is, we would change specular. And the specular will control basically how sharp or how bright, I guess you could say, the reflecting light off of this object is. So objects that tend to be more polished or more shiny, I guess you could say, is going to have higher reflectivity in the specular. Now I purposely skipped metallic, and there's a reason for that, because we are going to look at it in a second once we get into some more reflections and stuff. A lot of these we don't have to worry about right now. Sheen is another one that kind of controls how much shine is coming off of the object. You also have the tint on the sheen. You don't see a big change here. It's not making a big difference. But the one that will change this object a lot is metallic. So if we want this to actually look like a metal sword, what we can do is drag up the metallic. And you'll see that the higher we go with the metallic, the more reflective this object becomes. All right? And the more metallic it looks. And that's what metal is known for. It's got a very contrasty, I guess you can say, look to it, just in the way that it reflects light. And so now we've cranked up that metallic a bit, and you can see that it's looking like sort of metallic, but you don't see any reflections really. So it's still just a very shiny plastic, or maybe a dull metal, a metal that doesn't reflect light, or doesn't reflect its environment. So let's say we want to make a object that reflects its environment. What we can do is go down to roughness, and basically the roughness is how rough the surface is. So if we bring down the roughness, our object will become more polished. Our object will become more shiny. And the reason for that is if you don't have any, if you have no roughness on the surface, then what it will do is it will reflect its environment perfectly, like a chrome. I guess like a chrome ball is super, super reflective because it has a very low roughness, has a very smooth surface, and it reflects its environment really, really well. Okay, so now it's starting to look like a metal, kind of a purple metal sword. And perhaps I want it to look more like metal, so I might change the base color to something like a sort of a grayish, I don't know, grayish blue a bit. Kind of like that. Maybe to me that looks more like almost like silver or something, or really nice steel. All right, so you can see that that is now really starting to look much better. All right, now that is basically how you would apply a material to the entire object, but perhaps we want to apply just maybe a different type of material to the sword blade versus the hilt of the sword. So how can we do that? Just to make things a little easier, I'm going to go back into modeling, and I'm going to switch to material view so I can see what's happening. I'm going to get out of edit mode for a second here. You'll see that we still have that nice same preview where we can see it. The reason I like shading is it gets rid of the grid and everything else, so you can really get a good look at your object. But we're going to go back to modeling just for this time. So we're going to go out of edit mode, hit tab, and we're going to set this thing up so that the blade is a different material than the handle. All right, this is going to be pretty common. Sometimes you'll have a single model, but you'll want different parts to be different materials. So, very first thing we'll do is we'll switch our view, and we'll go to top view. So I'm in top view right now. It's going to be a little easier for selecting the objects that we want from this sword. So I'm in top view, there it is. And I'm going to want to select the blade itself. Okay, first thing I'll do is I'll get my material properties showing again. Make sure the preview, yeah, I don't know why the preview's not showing. Hopefully yours will. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into edit mode. So I'm going to hit tab. And I want to switch to wireframe mode. And I'll explain why in a second. But I'm going to go to wireframe mode. And I'm going to go to face select for this object. And I'm just going to click and drag around the entire blade. Now, if I was doing this, if I wanted to do it really proper, I'd be a lot more careful with it. I wouldn't just be making a selection like this, but because it's a tutorial, I'm trying to do it relatively quick. That is more or less the blade selected there. All right, I might have a few faces from the hilt that got included in that, but again, if I was going to make it perfect, I would worry about that if I was doing my own job, sort of my own project. Okay, so the blade is selected, and you can see that the entire object still has that material that we created earlier. Now what we're going to do is I'm going to switch it into material preview, and I'm going to hit the little plus sign up here. You see this little plus sign? What that's going to do is it's going to apply or add a second material to this one object. So you can see we're on the Skyrim glass sword, and we've got the base material, but now we're adding another one, and we're going to make a new material for that. And let's create kind of a greenish glass, similar to the Skyrim glass material. All right, and we'll bring up the metallic, we'll bring down the roughness. And the trick here to get this one to actually, and by the way, this for some reason is actually showing now. I don't know why Material 1 doesn't, but this is the preview I was hoping for. If we want this to actually apply to those faces that we selected, we have to hit Assign. And what will happen is all those faces on that one model will now have that material assigned to those faces. So if we go back into shading view, we take a look at this sword, now it looks pretty cool because we've got the blade as a different material from the actual handle. And like I said, you can see some pieces I missed. I wasn't very careful, but if I was doing this, you know, professionally, I would be really careful and get every face that needed to be that material. All right, so you can see how that works. We got two materials, so when I select this object and I go into my material view and I scroll up, you'll see I got both. And at any time, if we want to change one or the other, all we have to do is click the material we want to edit. Let's say instead of green, we want a different color, red maybe. Boom. Simple, easy, one click, or whatever you want to change in here, and it's going to allow you to do that really quick. Okay, and those materials are saved for this object. All right, so let's save that, and actually I'm just going to close it, but if you guys want to save it, you can use this as reference. But now let's go on to something a little different. So I'm going to close this, and I'm going to open up the file called skull.blend. And here we go. Let's get the skull opened up. There's the skull. Okay, so kind of the same sort of thing. What if we want to create an object that is maybe not just highly reflective, but also see-through, like glass or maybe water, or some sort of a see-through object. And the reason I picked the skull is because I thought right away, like the crystal skull, I'm thinking that would be kind of a good example. So the first thing I want to show you is if you go into, it doesn't really matter what mode you go into, if you're in Material Preview, to the right of this, you've got the little pull-down arrow. And this will show you what the world is currently reflecting. So if I click this, I can pick sort of different environments that this world is going to basically reflect on this object. So you can see all these different environments. And these are just kind of the built-in ones. You can add more if you really wanted to. But they give you kind of a nice preview of like daytime scenes and nighttime scenes and outside versus indoor scene. You know what I mean? There's a wide variety of them. And you can change them to whatever you want. So I'll show you how that looks really quick before we actually do the skull. If I click New on this skull, and I crank the metallic, and I bring down the roughness, this basically becomes a chrome skull. And like I said, if I want this to reflect a sort of different scene than the default one, I just clicked this to go down, pick a different, oops, pick the same one. If I pick a different one, you get to see sort of reflections in a different sort of way. Now that's all good when you're creating things that look metallic. But what happens if you want to create something that's a liquid, like or glass, something that's see-through, and it's going to actually reflect the scene around it? Well, for that we need to do something a little different. If we're just looking at how the material is going to react to the environment around it, then what we need to do first of all is create an environment image or an environment texture that's going to fill this scene. And you'll see why in a second. So we're going to click the world properties. And inside the world properties here you have color. And this is a handy thing. If you want the background to be more dark, for example, you can set the color of the background to basically whatever you want. And I don't know why that's not allowing me to see that. Oh, I got to be in rendered? Yeah, I got to be in rendered. So this will let you change the color of the scene to whatever you want. And like I said, if you go black, it becomes really, really dark. All right. So we're going to go back to just our preview. But let's say I want to have a world that is going, basically a world in this scene that I'm going to be able to see through this object and actually allow us to see transparent material. I'll show you what I mean. If I click this little dot next to color, I'm going to click Environment Texture. And I'm going to hit Open. And inside that folder I got a file. It's called an HDR file. You can look these up. They're called environment textures. They're usually going to be HDR files. And if I hit Open, now watch what happens. That image now, you won't see anything change here, but if I switch to rendered view, now my background will be that picture. Now you might be saying, what's the point? Why would I do that? Well, now I have an environment that my object can not only reflect, but also it'll work for transparency as well. By assigning just a simple one of the presets, it won't work for images that are transparent because there's nothing for it to actually show through the object. And I'll show you what I mean in a second. So if we select this skull, we go to materials, what we can do is actually create a very quick transparent object by going to here where it says surface. We're going to click that. You're going to see a bunch of sort of presets for different types of materials and sort of materials that you can start with. And the one I'm going to use is called glass. If I turn that on, now my object looks like it is made of glass rather than just the reflective object like a metal. Now you can see that that environment is actually showing through that skull rather than just reflecting on it. Another thing you can do in this window is you can change the color of the glass. So let's say I wanted more of like a reddish tinted glass. Again, you can see how the light shines through that. It looks really realistic. You can adjust the roughness. So if you want it to be more of a frosted glass rather than completely see-through, again, that's something you can change there. Now the IOR, which stands for Index of Refraction, is a very important setting. Right now it's set to 1.45, which is kind of the default for glass. but every liquid and every object that you can see through is going to have a slightly different index of refraction. So let's say I wanted this to be water. Maybe I want this to be a water skull rather than a glass skull. The index of refraction for water is 1.33. What you'll see happen is all the reflections inside of the head change. And now we actually have the proper refraction. That's what this is called inside of here. We have the proper refraction for water. Okay, so this is actually mimicking how water would refract that image through it. All right, so you can see how that works. It works pretty slick, works really nice, and it actually makes that look very believable as a glass or a water material. All right, so let's save that and we're done with it. Let's look at one more example. We're going to go into the room. We're going to open up the room file. And in the room file, I've kind of set up this environment where I've got 3 planes. They're acting as walls here, and then I got a floor, and I've got a sphere kind of in the middle. What we're going to look at for this one is we're going to actually look at some rendering options, which will allow us to not only use textures that rely on real photographs, but also to create objects that accurately reflect the environment that they're in. And I'll show you what I mean in a sec here. So we're going to go straight to rendered view. That's the last one, rendered view. And when we do that, we're going to see this little preview of this render. And what I did in the scene is I set up a spotlight above the sphere. We'll see why later. And inside of this tab right here, it's called Render Properties. This is going to give us all sorts of options that we can use to kind of make our environment more realistic and more believable. The only one we're going to set right now, but we will change this later, is we're going to turn on bloom. And bloom is going to kind of give our scene sort of a softer look. Tends to glow a little bit more. You probably didn't see much of a change there. It's very, very subtle. But now let's pretend that this floor here is not just a material that we can change. You know, we could create a floor. We could change the color to something like, let's say, a brownish. You know, maybe it's supposed to represent a wood floor. But it's not very believable because the material is all one color. And obviously, if this was a real floor, it would have actual wood grain and actual texture to it. So the way we could do that, there's a couple ways we could do that, but the easiest way, I would say, is to click this plane. You can apply a base color if you want. And then what we're going to do is to the right of the base color, we're going to click this little dot, and we're going to tell it that we want to create an image texture on this plane. It's going to go black. What we're going to do is we're going to hit open. And in the room folder, we're going to select the wood file, wood JPEG, and hit open. And now what will happen is that wood image, which is just one that I grabbed off Google, that wood texture is now applied to that floor. Now, one question that comes up quite a bit is how can I increase or decrease the size of the texture? Well, there's a couple things you have to check. First of all, you want to make sure that it's mapped correctly. So for a floor, it's going to be flat. You also want to make sure it's a repeating image, something that's going to repeat nicely so that you don't see the edges of the material when it repeats, when it gets tiled. I'll show you what I mean in a sec. But let's say we wanted these floorboards to be slightly bigger or slightly smaller. What we could do is we could go into UV editing, this tab up here, UV editing. And in here, you can see, I'd also, because it splits it in two, I would switch this right side to rendered so you could actually see the material. And what you would do is you would go over on this side here, press the A key, A to select all, or you can drag a selection. And as you can see, these 4 points are basically referring to the 4 points of this plane. And over on the side, if we press S to scale it, you can see that our plane controls, or the size of the plane controls how big or how small the image is on top of it. And you might be wondering, how does this work? Well, if you notice, like I said, that this square is the plane, then the smaller it becomes, the bigger the boards are going to become. And in opposite sort of, in the opposite here is if we enlarge the plane, then the floorboards become smaller. Right? So that's how we can control the tiling of our pictures or our image textures that we put onto our objects. I'm going to switch back to layout. Let's say we're happy with that. Now for these two walls, I'm going to put some bricks on there. So I'm going to go click a new material, and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to go to base color, image texture. I'm going to open it, and I'm going to get the stone texture. And there it is. Okay. Now, we could give this any name we want. I can call it stone if I really want to. Any name that makes sense to me. I'll call it stone wall. Okay. And watch. If we select this wall, all we have to do is click this little pull down, and we can just click stone wall. And it will apply the same material to both, because it's already saved in this material library of all the materials in this scene, which is very handy. Super handy. Now, one last thing I want to show you guys. We've got kind of a scene sort of started and set up here, kind of very basic. But I want to show you something that you will probably run into while you're working with Blender. If you have a material such as this ball, and I create a new texture for it, and I make this material very reflective. So I'm going to bring up my metallic, I'm going to bring down my roughness, and oops, I'll just set it to 0. It's fine. You're going to notice that this material is not reflecting anything at all. And you might be wondering why. You might be wondering, why is it not showing? Because you'd think if this was a reflective ball, you would see the floor, you would see the walls behind it. Well, one of the reasons is because when we went into rendering properties, by turning on bloom and by also changing our shading to use the lights and the scene in the world, we basically have told it to ignore anything that it can reflect inside of sort of this world that it's in. If we wanted it to just reflect a map just to show us that it was reflective, what we could do is we could turn off these two options, and like in our last example, it'll just reflect that sort of default world that we pick, which doesn't make any sense because, again, that doesn't match what we've got here. So we're going to turn on scene and lights, lights and world again. And the trick for this is we need to first of all select the object. We'll edit that in a sec. But inside rendering properties, we need to turn on screen space reflections. And we also want to turn on refraction, which is inside of there, in case we want to make it into a water material or something else. And you'll notice now that it sort of reflects that a little bit more accurately than it did before. Another thing we can do is we can click that object and go into material, scroll all the way down, and right here in settings we would turn it on here as well. Okay? And I have no idea why that just made it disappear. So let's just turn it off. I guess if it works without it, then let's leave it at that. But basically that will now give you more of an accurate reflection of the environment that it's in. Alright, and we can see in the preview, that's how that object would look, and you can see the floor, you can see the walls reflecting, and based on how we sort of turn the camera, we've got pretty accurate reflections here for this particular environment. And the same would be true if we turn this into a water object. So if I click this, or a glass sphere, if I click this and I change the surface to glass like we did with the skull, you're going to see we don't see anything happen, but what we got to do is turn on screen space refraction, and now you'll see that it refracts, because remember, refraction is the light passing through an object, reflection is the light reflecting off of an object. Okay, so when we're talking about glass or liquids, we want to think about refraction rather than reflection. Okay, so this is refracting the scene accurately. All right, that seems to be doing more or less the right thing here. All right, and we can switch back and forth. If I want to go back to our old one, I'll just go to principled and put it back. So anyways, that's how materials work. You can see that there's a lot you can do with materials. I've only really just scratched the surface here for the things that we can do with materials. There's so many things you can experiment with to make your materials look better. And we'll be getting into some of the more advanced options in a later tutorial. But understanding how materials work and how textures work across objects is very important if you want to make your models look realistic in the future. So thanks for watching. Hopefully you got through that okay. Let me know if you have any questions at all. Thanks.